Ela, na mihi nui kia koutou. E na rau rangatira mā, no mai, haere mai, whakatau mai, ki tēnei hui mariko. Ko Barry Coatsahau, ko te kārahi o te putea whai whakaaro. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tihei Māori ora. So a very warm welcome to you all. I'm Barry Coates. I'm CEO of the charity Mindful Money. This is the 10th seminar in our series. The seminars are held on Wednesdays at 12:15, and videos and podcasts of the previous seminars are available on Mindful Money's website, on YouTube and other great websites. I can recommend some of the past episodes. There's some really interesting seminars in there. The issue for today is investment in New Zealand's forests. So this seminar came about when we, along with many other New Zealanders, saw the impact of the cyclone causing slash and forest debris to end up blighting communities in Tairāwhiti and other areas of New Zealand. So we also saw the great organising work that happened in Tairāwhiti, and particularly the role of Manu Caddie, who's our first panellist tonight. So Manu is co-founder of Matawai Bio. He's innovating in developing natural extracts in accordance with leading IP and Indigenous knowledge agreements. He founded Hikarangi Bioactives and is project manager for Tairāwhiti Charitable Trust. Warm welcome to you, Manu.
Kia ora, Barry. It's good to be here.
Manu, could you start by giving us some background to forest management in Tairāwhiti? Where did this problem originate?
Well, I probably need to go back a few 100 million years and talk about the geology of the region. I'm not sure we got that long, but it's certainly been a very erosion-prone part of the country. It's, I'm not sure how much the seismic plates have to do with it, but we've got the Hikarangi Trench there, and it feels like the mountainous part of the country here has been pushed up over time, but it's still quite a young geology, so it's still settling down and things. And before humans were here, as I understand it, there was significant erosion issues. And they reckon that some of the scientists have worked out that over the last 20,000 years, there's enough erosion that's come down in one catchment to fill a cube that's 12 kilometres on each side. So a lot of sediment. But in the last couple of hundred years, since we've really accelerated deforestation, we've moved the rate of that up 5 times. So what was there previously in sort of natural erosion has really accelerated. So 120 years ago, lots of the region was cleared for farming, at least sort of 3/4. So about a quarter of the region still in native forest, though that's really under threat from predators and is on the verge of collapse. But the rest of it was mostly cleared for farms. And then sort of 50 odd years later, middle of the 20th century, really sort of realised that might not have been such a good idea, and the Crown and locals looked at rapidly replanting pines rather than natives. And post-Bowler, so even before Bowler, like in the sort of 1970s and 80s, there was a lot of pine plantation planned and starting to get underway. Certainly Bowler in 88 accelerated that process, and we saw a lot of what were large stations convert to pine forest. And then, of course, we had the politics of all of that and a lot of it being privatised. So it was initially Crown forest, and public money paid for most of those forests to be established. And then they were sold off for quite a low price to mostly overseas owners now. So about 60% of land that has forests on it is overseas owned. That's the actual land. And then there'll be quite a few more forests that are on Māori land or other locally owned land that's got the cutting rights, and the trees are owned by a foreign company. So there's still a good chunk that's in New Zealand ownership, and about 13% Māori is on Māori land. So that's sort of the very quick history of it. And in the last few years, sort of in the last 5 years, with the price of carbon increasing, there's been another rapid expansion of conversion from farmland to pine plantations. And some of the estimates, one of the local councillors did some work with federated farmers, and they over a 2-year period in the last couple of years, there were about over 30,000 hectares converted from farmland to pine plantations. So people are concerned about that. It has a big impact, particularly if it is going to be permanent carbon forest, that there's not a lot, potentially not, particularly with pine, not a lot of jobs that come with that, and there'll be jobs lost from the production forestry sector of harvesting, which has its own issues, and the farms that are losing workers in the process. So lots going on, and then we have catastrophic climate change come along, and some acceleration of that erosion process, and we've seen massive sedimentation and, as you said, forestry slash and other woody debris, not just from the pine forest, but coming down the waterways and choking not only streams and rivers but into the coastal marine area, and real concerns about the fisheries there and so forth, and some loss of life and damage to property, tens of millions of damage that's going to be harder and harder to insure. And farmers, I wouldn't be surprised if a number, this is just the straw that breaks the camel's back, and they need to walk off the land, because we're just sheep and beef farming on the coast here. It's no dairy, so they've only just been making ends meet, and this is happening every year. We've had 4 major events in the last 12 months, and the cost of replacing fences and all of that is just huge.
Manu, can you just give us a little snapshot of some of the community organising work that you've been involved in response to these latest disasters?
Yeah, we had a group of residents around the region who were very concerned about the land use trends and the impacts of poor forestry practices, that clear felling on steep erosion prone land. Organised a petition in January after Cyclone Hale. I think it's up over 11,000 signatures now, but that was enough to get council on board to say, hey, we need to do something about this. Central government set the rules for what can happen on forestry blocks, and they supported a request to government for an independent inquiry. What we got out of that was a ministerial inquiry. It wasn't quite what we were hoping for, but we'll take it. And through that have been able to do quite a bit of research, and we've put the call out and had over 100 volunteers offered to be part of a submission writing process, looking back across the history of publications, both scientific and policy documents, minutes of meetings, working groups, and all sorts of things that have gone on to set those rules around what can happen on the land. And that's been collated into one big submission, and that inquiry is due at the end of this week, so 30th of April. The panel need to present it back to the ministers, and we're hoping that that will be made public straight away with its recommendations, and we'll see just how bold the panel have been and what they've heard from many residents around the region. And we're able to organise video and photos and testimonies from people, so those have all gone into submissions, and I think they had over 300. So yeah, we'll see what they come out with.
So congratulations on that stuff. I've seen some write-ups, and it's been really powerful and empowering processes that you put in place. So congratulations for that. The inspiration for this seminar also came from discussions with Philip Mills and Simon Miller of Pure Advantage. Their research program, O Tato Ngahere, Our Forests, works together with Tane's Tree Trust. And tonight we have their research manager, Meg Graeme, as our second panelist. Meg has an MSc in marine science, but now focuses her work on sustainable land use to help address the issues of coastal sedimentation and biodiversity loss. She manages Tairāwhiti Tree Trust, transitioning exotic forests to natives research. And that program is funded by the Ministry of Primary Industries, MPI. So a very warm welcome to you, Meg.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Meg, can you start by giving us a background to the current research that you're doing?
Sure. I might just take a step back. The first project I got involved with Tairāwhiti Tree Trust was looking at the transition of coastal buffers. So again, it was with pine, but the pine forests on our dunes were all dying because they're a monoculture and the forestry behind was losing its protection. So we looked at how you get a sustainable native forest there using the pines to kickstart it and get biodiversity benefits as well as look after your plantation behind. So that sort of links in a bit, but now we're looking at the wider issue of transitioning pine to native anywhere in the country. So it's a much bigger project. And we're looking at what the bioclimatic conditions are that would be conducive around the country to where you could do this, and where it's going to be a bit of a struggle and you'd have to put in a lot of management input. We're also doing a stream that's concentrating in Tairāwhiti, where we're looking at the native understory under the pine canopy and the different characteristics of the pine canopy and how that affects the understory. And then we've got another work stream which is it's got trials. And so we're going to have exclosures and planting, and then look at what will come up naturally and what will survive planted, and the effect of browsing, of course, because that is a big issue, and then manipulate the pine canopy to see what light conditions are the most favourable for the native forest. So out of all that, we want to also model the carbon and what that's going to do over time, which is very important. And then come out with some guidelines and hopefully provide a bit of a definition of what would be called a transitional forest and what you need to meet, the steps along the way that forest needs to show, and that it is actually transitioning.
So one of the contexts for this, Meg, is the rules around permanent forests and their access to carbon credits. The assumption being that you can plant exotics until they give rise to a native forest, and somehow that's seen to be a kind of an automatic process that naturally happens. Your research is going to help understand those processes, right?
Yes, put a bit of science behind that, and actually try and sort of indicate what sort of management is required, and also, this monitoring, you've got to actually show you are doing that, because there is a lot of concern around these plant and walk away forests, which, depending where you are in the country, whether you've got seed sources nearby for the natives to come back, or whether you're running with deer and goats, there's no way you're ever going to go back to a sustainable native forest. So putting a bit of science behind all that.
The third strand to the seminar today is the policy framework. There's been growing concern over the use of emissions trading scheme credits for forest sequestration, and there's concern that forest credits, the abundance of forest credits, are undermining the effectiveness of the ETS. Our third panelist, Dr. Christina Hood, is Head of Climate Change at Compass Climate. She's formerly head of the Climate Change Unit at the International Energy Agency, and she's been part of MFAT's climate change negotiations team at international negotiations. So very warm welcome to you, Christina.
Thank you.
Christina, can you start by giving us an overview of forest credits in the ETS?
I guess there's a couple of things coming up that people that are particularly relevant to this discussion. The government has signalled that it's going to review the ETS around this question of what they are calling the balance between gross emission reductions and in providing an incentive for forestry removals in the ETS. So currently the New Zealand ETS treats those two things as being completely equivalent. A removal of a tonne from a pine forest is counted as exactly the same way as a tonne of burning fossil fuel and releasing a tonne of CO2 into the atmosphere. That's just how it's set up. And it's set up that way in mirroring our national and international targets, which also allow, that also count things in that way. So it's kind of set up in that sort of a compliance mentality of mapping the targets onto a domestic policy. But it's quite clear that that this is a problem, and there's three principal reasons for that. One is that you shouldn't actually be trading off removals from forestry against gross emission reductions. We need both of those things to get to an actual low carbon future. We need to get off fossil fuels, get those emissions to as close to zero as possible, not just offset them. And we need lots of forest restoration, and we're going to need trees for wood, for the bioeconomy, to draw down, and forest restoration to draw down the kind of overshoot in emissions from the fossil fuels that we shouldn't have been burning over the last 50 years, but are continuing to do so. So we shouldn't be trading those things off, but we currently are. So that's one of the kind of the question marks. But the Climate Change Commission said, look, even if you keep our current net target that does combine the two, even then there's a strong case for having a greater focus on gross reductions. And that's because it's just a more enduring way of solving the problem. If you offset with pine trees now, your emissions are still going to be high in 2050, and you're going to have to keep planting more and more and more trees on an ongoing basis. And it's just not a sustainable way to address the problem. The second reason the government's concerned about it is that there's a real looming kind of supply-demand balance in the ETS coming, where so many pine forests are going in the ground that there's going to be an increasing number of forestry credits available over the next 15 years or so. And at the same time, emissions are actually coming down in the ETS. And at some point around 2035, those two lines cross, and there's actually not enough buyers in the ETS to even buy all of the forestry credits that are going to be generated. So you're looking at a sort of a market price collapse scenario where there's more supply than there is demand just inside the ETS. That's not to say that the forests are a bad thing, which is what the agriculture sector would tell you. It's just that we need to kind of rethink how this balance between gross reductions and removals works and how you pay for different things. And then the third leg that's the concern is this question around pine versus Indigenous forests and forestation, because Indigenous native forests grow more slowly, but they grow for longer. This is something where we would be looking at not 10 years, not 30 years, but 50, 100, 150 years and still having a benefit. And the question is, how do we design a policy framework that brings forward some of that really long-term benefit to today to enable the establishment of those forests? They're going to have that really, really long time horizon. And the ETS just doesn't do that. And I don't think, in some ways I don't think it can, because it's just about the number of tonnes of carbon emitted and absorbed in any given year. We need to be thinking a bit more smartly about how the ETS and other incentive structures all fit together to make that happen. So the government should be coming out with a consultation document soonish. I'm not sure exactly when, but it's going to be a pretty interesting and probably a pretty fraught process. I think there's going to be legal questions around what property rights existing foresters think that they have based on already being registered in the ETS. Do they have a property right to own, sell, create credits? Okay, but then on top of that, do they have a property right to be able to get a certain price, which seems more of a stretch to me. So there might be some questions around, how you separate that out. Government might think about there are all sorts of different ways that they might go, and I imagine that they'll put in a bunch of options in the consultation. Anything from grandparenting in existing forests to paying for all of them outside the ETS to limits. There's a whole range of possibilities.
Thank you, Christina. Let's come back to some of these issues together as a panel. I'd like to invite Manu and Meg to join us. Manu, to kick off the panel discussion, I'd like to invite you to talk about some of the issues that have been raised so far from the Tairāwhiti perspective, understanding that your situation in Tairāwhiti is really an example of many of the impacts across New Zealand, perhaps particularly in Hawke's Bay and Coromandel, but also elsewhere. And I'd like you to, if you could to talk about what can be done in the submission that you have put into the ministerial inquiry on these issues. It would be really helpful to kick off the discussion.
Yeah, I guess that particular inquiry is very focused on land use as opposed to ETS questions, but the panel certainly took a big interest in the ETS settings and how that has been incentivising the shift in land use, for better or worse, depending on your perspective. And I think there's general consensus. Even the forestry industry are saying we need to change, we need to retire significant amounts of land. I think the rub will be just how much and exactly where that is to happen. So that's still to be worked through, but they're saying that as much as anybody else, well, not quite as much as some others, but they're acknowledging that needs to happen. So that will require, as Meg's saying, that may be pine. Many of us would prefer that wasn't pine, that there's some other options there, and talking to ecologists and so forth about what the alternatives. We're saturated in pine already, and the idea of more of it to support natives is really challenging, particularly given Megan and her colleagues are only just starting this research on whether it's possible, let alone how it might be done to have a successful management regime, acknowledging that every hillside and catchment has a microclimate and particular issues that we're going to need a range of management regimes. It's not just going to be one that's going to work for everywhere. And so until that's proven, which is going to take some years, quite some years, there's going to be a lot of reservation about the idea of supporting more pine plantations. So the submissions are saying no more clear fell harvesting on highly erosion-prone land, and we don't need to plant another pine tree in Tairāwhiti. Fine elsewhere, potentially, Central Plateau, where we don't have the same issues, maybe fine, but we don't need any more here. So we'll see, again, what the panel comes out with there. And I think the other issue with the ETS is cynicism or scepticism about its environmental benefits beyond the carbon sequestration, and concern that it's a get-rich-quick scheme for venture capital and others who are looking for ways to make a buck off the next trend. And so what we'd also really like to see is a portion of those carbon credits income being set aside for these transitions from, if they say that it can transition from pine to native, let's put that money into an independent escrowed account and let it be there, because these regimes are going to be expensive. You're going to need massive pest control, which there's barely any of at the moment. And they're more expensive to plant and to look after as they get going. So it's going to be expensive, and the government's not going to want to fork out for all of that. It should come out of some of the profits that are being made off the ETS. Thanks,
Manu. That all sounds very coherent to me. Meg, how does all of this look from an ecologist perspective?
So I think most people would agree that on the steep lands we want to have permanent forest, and to be sustainable that needs to be native forest and diverse, not a monoculture. So I think one thing, just looking at Tairāwhiti, I wouldn't like to see any more clear felling on that steep land. The pines are doing a good job for the moment, and the question is, how do we transition those? I'm not talking about elsewhere, Manu, you can decide whether it's pines or native that you plant, but the point is, whatever you plant, you have to do pest control. Doesn't matter if it's a Kānuka pioneer crop or a pine pioneer crop, you've got to do the pest control. And also we are going to have to plant native seed islands because they're now lacking throughout the landscape. So again, that goes for native or pine, whether, you know, whatever you got your first crop as. And I was just thinking about something you said, Manu, about the carbon forest not employing people. That depends on what, if you are a transitioning forest and you're doing it well, there is going to be a lot of work that's required to do that pest control and the planting that I was talking about, and just the whole managing of it all. So there is going to be quite a bit of work involved with that and a lot of cost. So that's where that's got to be worked through for the long term, because it's not, you don't do it one-off pest control, it's ongoing.
Thanks very much, Meg. That's very interesting. So this is a part about regulating forest management much more strictly around not only new plantings, but also existing forests of exotics, pine and others. So I wanted to turn to Christina and say, well, isn't the problem also a mismatch of economic incentives? The fact that we're giving carbon credits for trees, but we're not giving any kind of economic benefit into the other role of native forests for biodiversity, for soil retention, for watershed protection, and these other functions that native forests can and do perform. Is there a way to build that into the picture?
Yeah, so my I guess my preferred solution at the moment in terms of this ETS review is actually to pay for all forestry carbon outside the ETS. So you kind of put just a firewall between the emitters on one side and the forestry benefits on the other. And then that allows government to potentially layer on payments for all of these other things that we find valuable to those forests that are providing those. And it also allows you to kind of put some of those conditionalities around it that Meg was talking about around, and Manu were talking about around the conditionality of release of units depending on milestones and transition and so on and so on. But I mean, even in that kind of world, it still relies on someone being willing to stump up to pay for those other benefits, and we're really bad at doing that. We just are. I mean, we pay for carbon because we have essentially it's because we have international targets, and those international targets create a constraint that creates a value for the emission reductions and removals. So there's something, that was what the ETS was originally designed to do. It was to pass on those international obligations down into the domestic economy. But there isn't an obligation on biodiversity or on erosion or on all of these things. And so it's harder because, I mean, you can certainly do the benefit cost analysis that says, oh, it would be absolutely worthwhile spending X $100 million doing this, but then you've still got to get someone to stump up with the X $100 million. And in policy, you get into the world of second and third best policy, and it's like, well, okay, ideally, that's what you would do. You would have the financial incentives that value all of those things. But if you're not going to do that, if we're not going to pay for biodiversity and erosion control benefits and all the rest of it, then should you use regulation to level the playing field and just say, okay, well, rather than paying extra for Indigenous over pine forests, we're just going to say you can't plant pine forests on particular regions. So you can use price and the layering of prices, or you can use regulation. And I think we have to be realistic about how much price governments are actually going to cough up.
What we've got with the ETS, or where the ETS came from, were those international commitments and obligations that New Zealand and other countries made. And I'm sort of hoping that what we saw last December in Montreal with biodiversity global commitments, restoring 30% of biodiversity in the world, and New Zealand signing up to that kind of framework might create this. We don't need to make a market out of everything necessarily, but that kind of international commitment that the government's making needs to be followed through somehow, and perhaps could be the equivalent in the biodiversity world as we have in the carbon world.
At this point, there's a sort of collective global ambition rather than individual countries having individual targets. So, yeah, well, I agree with your hope on that one.
That's why we'd use the ETS potentially if you have to put your carbon credits towards your work transitioning, and then you'd have some confidence that you're going to have ongoing money going towards it for the moment.
Christina, how substantial do you think these reforms are likely to be? Will they deal with the issues of the rather artificial market that's been created under the ETS and all of the political lobbying that goes on around that? Do you see any possibility that there will be an introduction, at least some elements of the previous proposal for more of a tax and dividend approach where there's greater certainty over the carbon price? Is that a possibility?
I think anyone who thinks that a carbon tax is more certain is dreaming, because it requires politicians to actually agree to set a price. It's one of the, an ETS is kind of an obfuscation in a way, but it's a way for saying, oh no, the market set that price. I only set an emissions constraint. I didn't do it. So I don't believe, I'm too cynical, but I don't believe that if our politicians were setting a carbon tax, it would have got to $80 a tonne last year. I just, so maybe I should have more faith in them, but allowing the market to rise is a different thing than setting the price. It's not going to, I think that the issue of how high and fast the price is going to be allowed to rise is going to be a really key part of the discussion, because part of the reason for, if you're going to uncouple in a way with the forestry payments from the gross emission reductions, part of the reason for that is that the prices that we have right now are high enough to incentivise land use change, but they are not high enough to incentivise gross emission reductions. So ECA is having to go out and subsidise Fonterra to do boiler switching. And if the carbon price were higher, they wouldn't have to do that. Fonterra would just see the signal that makes it cost effective for them to do it. So we need prices that are more like, $100, $150 a tonne rather than $50, $80 a tonne. And but those flow through into petrol prices, only in a relatively small way, though, to be honest. But it's something that politicians are really sensitive to. So it is going to be, a really interesting debate, and it's going to be quite important in terms of, are we really committed to making these reductions, or are we not?
One of the simple things that could be done was around the permanent forest category, and the government proposal was to exclude exotics from that. A group of Māori forestry companies got together and lobbied hard the minister and threatened litigation, and he did a U-turn, the previous Minister of Forestry. And I think if we'd seen that, or when we do see that policy come through, that does exclude exotics, significant impact on some of these. We're working on that over the coming weeks, because I think there's still an opportunity there to encourage Māori landowners, shareholders, all want to see natives rather than pine, and those board members and the lobbyists need to be challenged by their shareholders as well.
But again, I'd just caution about being black and white, because pines have a role to play in some places, I think. They tend to get painted in a bad light, and that's because they're planted in a monoculture and then they're clear felled. But they're an excellent tree at stabilising the land and growing fast and absorbing the carbon. And from my observations, I know that they will transition. It's just that we have got such an issue with browsers and the lack of seed sources So I wouldn't like to see. I see them as a positive, as a step on the way to native forest, and it's how you do the pine trees.
I think the reality is we've got, like 800,000 hectares of land in Tairāwhiti. About 250,000 roughly are in pine at the moment. So there's plenty of pine to go around. There's other species that can grow almost as fast as pine. We don't need any more of them, and then they're not going to go away overnight. The price could collapse, and forest owners, based on Christina's predictions, could be left with stranded assets, and that's going to be a real challenge, and the kind of thing we should be addressing with policy now to protect the communities that are going to be left with those and when that happens. So yeah, certainly pine can be good for some things. We just don't need any more of them in this part of the world. They're slow, or they're shallow rooted, so we've seen some massive wind throw in the current, the last couple of cyclones that haven't been good. And if we can get some other species that are deeper rooted that are going to be around longer, then we really need to accelerate that process.
Yeah, but they're better than farmland. So, yeah.
Thank you. I want to bring in a question from the chat. It's around the risks from pine forests and from exotics, and the more technical issues around the transition to natives. Meg, in your introduction, you talked a little bit about these issues. Can you tell us more about what the transition looks like, what it entails, what kind of processes are needed? Please.
Okay. Well, a big one in my mind is we're going to have more and more fire risk. So, of course, pines are a risk there, as is the Kānuka Manuka. So it's getting the mix of species is what's been found overseas with fires, is getting that diversity and the big leaf green shrubs, the understory, which a lot of our understory is very good at not burning quickly. So there's fire, there's the two big things, as I keep going on about, is the pest animals, and unless we do pest animal control at a really large landscape scale, that's going to be an issue for getting any revegetation happening. We might get the non-palatable natives coming back again, but they'll be only slightly better than having a monoculture of pine. The problems with the pine will be, and this is where I think our research will help to sort of clarify this, is how much light you need. Ideally, after 30, 40 years, you're going to get some natural gaps in there anyway, and you're not actually going to have to spend money on making gaps. But as long as you've got your browsers and your predators under control, then the birds should be spreading the seed, as long as you've got the seed islands, which is you've also established and haven't been browsed. So yeah, it's sort of a cycle. We've just got to get straight on to the pest control and the planting of natives.
So thanks very much. We've got another couple of questions in the chat around forest regeneration, and so I'd like to focus on this issue, and also this can be a final round because these seminars go really quickly. Can you give us a perspective first, Manu, on the issues of regeneration from a Tairāwhiti perspective? One of the issues is, are you replacing a monoculture of exotics like pine potentially with a monoculture of native tree equivalent? Is that the kind of future, or is the future around more diverse forests? Give us your perspective.
Yeah, I think what we need is a more diverse economy and a more diverse land use. So there are opportunities that are emerging. We've got Kānuka products, taking the oil out of the leaves and things, and working on sustainable harvest regimes and developing products at a high value. And some of those can be wild harvested, and there may be cropping as well. In a sort of monoculture, I'd rather have a monoculture of diverse natives than one species, exotic species. But so I think there'll be a patchwork of different options. That's the vision, I guess, for the region. There'll still be a place for pine and farming on the less erosion-prone land. And that's those are really valuable and important parts of our economy that we want to hold on to. We just need to diversify it and get some higher value opportunities and better jobs. So lots more investment in innovation and research and development is important, and developing those markets, and groups like Tairāwhiti.nz, working on sort of what would a platform and a market look like that you could invest in these sort of projects, both from a corporate and philanthropic and a government perspective, to increase regenerative farming and the kind of restoration of native landscape that you're looking for.
So, Christina, can you put your optimistic hat on and give us some idea of the good things that could come out of this ETS review in terms of reform?
My background's actually in the energy sector, and so my overriding ambition for the ETS review is to have a much clearer signal that we actually have to stop emitting from fossil fuels. We just have to do that. That's part of it. That's what it means to have a carbon transition. So that's my number one. And but trees storing carbon, even if temporarily rather than permanently, has value, and we need to reflect that and value that, and finding a way to pay for that doesn't derail emission reductions is what we need to do. And it's doable. It's just having the kind of courage to change things.
Yeah, thanks for that. Meg, to you, what are some of the directions that you think in terms of policy reform would make sense from the ecologist perspective of regenerating natives? What are some good outcomes?
Directions forward. I'd like to see more of what's happening in Tairāwhiti and expanding that out. I think the Tairāwhiti area, that East Cape area, is going to be our number one big landscape example of whether this can work or not. And we really need to get our headwaters protected and get people employed in protecting those. And then once we get protected, looking at ways to use them. But that is going to have so much value for people downstream and giving them, a sense of hope into the future.
That's great. I wish we had 3 hours to continue this discussion rather than a rather short 45 minutes. I hope this gives an opportunity for those who are watching or listening to then follow up on these issues, and we'll include some of the links on our website. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. Congratulations on the great work that you're doing, and more power to you for getting some of the changes that you seek. Those who are listening, can you please pass on the link to the seminar to others who you think may be interested? This is the way that we get more viewership, and we really appreciate it when you include it on social media and other links. So this series of seminars would not be possible without support of some generous donors that help make it happen. So thanks very much to Mercer, to New Zealand Green Investment Finance, to Alphinity, and to the Medical Assurance Society, MASS. Thanks also to silver sponsors Booster, Harbour Asset Management, Chapman Tripp, and Trustees Executors Limited. And finally, thanks also to Pi Funds and Pathfinder. So next week, we have a different view on forests. We're particularly talking about the impacts of global deforestation, particularly looking at tropical forests around the world. We're looking at some of the drivers for deforestation, some of the issues that are happening with regard to new EU regulations on trade in forest products related to deforestation. And we're looking at investment in the companies cited for deforestation, by New Zealand investment funds and New Zealand investors. So thanks all for coming today. Please come back 12:15 next week. Stay active, invest mindfully, mā te wā.